Morning Live. Now, as we've been reporting in our lead story this morning, the ANC's National Executive Committee has resolved that all leaders charged with fraud, corruption, money laundering and racketeering must step aside within 30 days. Now, the party has been at odds with Secretary-General Ace Magashule's refusal to step aside amid corruption charges relating to when he was Premier of the Free State Province. President Cyril Ramaphosa's closing remarks were delayed when members would not agree or could not agree on the final text on this step-aside resolution. The president finally said that the party agreed that those charged with criminal conduct must vacate their positions in the organization. So for more on this and a bit more clarity, we are joined by the ANC's national spokesperson, Pule Mabe. Mr. Mabe, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Morning, Sakina, and morning to your viewers.
Let's start with step aside and what does that actually mean? When you say step aside, does this mean vacate your position, and in what sense? Does it mean you still get paid, you suspended on full pay, or what exactly does step aside mean?
Well, thanks for asking, Sakina. Actually, the 30-day period agreed upon by the National Executive Committee will be able to allow the leadership the space to be able to clarify all of that. Provincial structures of the African National Congress have also asked for an audience with the national officials to be able to make sure that some of the issues that you two are raising now are clearly clarified, so that in the execution and operationalization of the step-aside principle, there is uniformity and consistency. You'd appreciate that the ANC has got a network of structures throughout the country. So in terms of how it executes and operationalizes its own decisions, its approach must at all times be consistent and be of a uniform nature, so that we do not find one structure here implementing a decision in another way or form and another structure there doing something else. You want to have clarity of thought that there is a shared understanding by structures of the ANC on the ground in terms of how they ought to be executing this.
So with that still not clarified, what does this mean for the implementation of this particular resolution? When does it take effect?
Okay, let me just go back, Sakina. That's why I said within the 30-day period, so the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress will effectively use that 30-day period to make sure that all of the grey areas that could be there, misunderstanding or misinterpretations that could be there or out in the public in terms of how this is being operationalized and what this actually means. I mean, you are raising a very fundamental point. That does it mean you get paid when you have stepped aside? What does it really mean? And for how long are you stepping aside? All those things are going to be clarified. So this period effectively allows for us to be able to clarify all of that, so that in the execution of this, there is a uniformity and consistency.
But when does the rule take effect, Mr. Mabe? Does it start this morning? Or when does it actually start? All those who are charged, those who need to take cognizance of this new resolution, when does that start?
Well, Sakina, you'd appreciate that this is a resolution taken by the African National Congress back in 2017. The 54th National Executive Committee Collective has been doing its work, one, to establish the guidelines, which process was led by the Treasurer-General. Those guidelines were ultimately adopted by the National Executive Committee, and then deal with all of the reports that were before the Integrity Commission and understand what were the sort of recommendations and allow the National Executive Committee the space to be able to attend to all of those issues. So that work has already happened. The 2017 resolution has not been suspended. What is now happening is that within this 30-day period, the Office of the Secretary-General will also have the space to be able to make sure that all of the cadres that could be affected by this decision are effectively notified, so that they have got this period to be able to deal with whatever issues that they might want to deal with. So that at the conclusion of the 30-day period, if no action has not been taken, Rule 25 of the African National Congress then gets to be activated.
So which structure of the ANC will be dealing with this?
It is going to be the Secretary-General's office as per the decision of the National Executive Committee. It is working together with provincial secretaries, because then they will be able to then say, these are the affected cadres in our province, these are the affected cadres in our region, and then those cadres would then be notified that this is the kind of actions that are now going to be undertaken, and this is what we are now expecting them to be doing.
And what would happen then? Because as you say now, the rule says step aside within 30 days or face suspension. And just going back to the 54th conference resolutions, just to touch on a few there, like the one says we demand that every cadre accused of or reported to be involved in corrupt practices accounts to the Integrity Committee immediately or faces DC processes. And also the ANC, we publicly dissociate ourselves from anyone, whether business donor, supporter or member, accused of corruption or reported to be involved in corruption. So that's quite a mouthful, and that's quite a daunting task. So with regard to the SG's office, where the SG himself is implicated at this time, what other structures would be brought to bear in order to assist with all of this?
Well, for now, Sakina, in terms of the decision of the National Executive Committee, it's going to be the Secretary-General's office. The NEC itself had appreciated steps undertaken by the Secretary-General voluntarily to also seek counsel from former leaders of the African National Congress, a process that he will be undertaking during this 30-day period. You would understand that it is not an easy one. I mean, the Secretary-General is part of the collective. He serves with the national officials and gets to be affected by this kind of a principle. So it is undesirable in that way. And the NEC has made observation as well in that regard, and had appreciated the steps that the SG has taken, and are going to appeal that we are at least given this 30-day period to be able to process this. You'd imagine that it's not an easy issue for the African National Congress, considering that the position of the Secretary-General is the second most prominent position in the African National Congress.
But doesn't the ANC have to be cognizant of and careful of the precedents that it sets in this regard? Because surely what you allow on the left, you should allow on the right. If you allow one member of the ANC to go through certain protocols and processes, it should be allowed for every member of the ANC, not?
Well, true, Sakina, true, very true, Sakina. Hence we are undertaking this process with maximum care and making sure that we still come back to yourselves and communicate the kind of actions that are being undertaken, considering that, of course, the decision itself also affects the second highest office in the African National Congress. So you'd imagine that it's not as easy like that, Sakina. We've got to make sure that we bring everyone on board and appreciate the process that the Secretary-General himself is undertaking, which is in fact showing cooperation and regard to ANC processes. I can tell you now, Sakina, that when officials came back to report to the National Executive Committee yesterday on the meetings they've had with provinces and on their own engagement, they really presented a united front. That's why our meeting didn't even take long. It was really easy to facilitate consensus from amongst members of the National Executive Committee and allow the President of the ANC to address the nation on the closing address of the National Executive Committee, so that there's clarity on the kind of decisions that the NEC arrived at.
And just with regard to some of the reports about the whole step-aside rule and some wording that slipped into a previous draft of 7 days to step aside that's now been taken to 30 days, what happened there?
Well, Sakina, we wouldn't even want to really enter that space. safe to say that when we concluded the National Executive Committee meeting last night, the NEC was quite united, did make an observation that there were some worrying signs of leakages, impression created out there of the NEC having been chaotic. So it was a little bit. So the NEC did observe all the things that played themselves out in the public with great concern, and said that it is important that how we hold and conduct ourselves must be consistent with the decorum of the National Executive Committee of the ANC, because we are the leadership of the movement in the country and are supposed to discharge the important responsibility of leading society.
Is this another matter of kicking the can down the road, Mr. Mabe? I look at one of your conference resolutions once again, which I stated to you earlier. We publicly dissociate ourselves from anyone, whether business, donor, supporter or member, accused of corruption or reported to be involved in corruption. That's absolutely clear. So have you done any of that? Has the ANC publicly distanced and disassociated itself from any such people?
Well, of course, Sakina, I mean, within this 30-day period, if you read what we are saying in the statement read out by the President of the ANC on behalf of the National Executive Committee, we had said that this 30-day period would allow for the consolidation of a list of such individuals, whether it's businesses or whether it's our own cadres in the movement who could be playing leadership roles here and there, so that they are accordingly advised where we need to publicly dissociate. We are also advised about such as well. So the process that we have undertaken as the African National Congress does provide us with the space to be able to do all of that.
But of course, if people have been charged, they've been charged. Those charges are not going to disappear unless there's evidence that emerges to the contrary. And given that several cases have been before the courts for quite some time, one would think that it's quite unambiguous what the ANC has to do, that it doesn't really need to go through all of these processes. But is this a case of the party trying to manage the fallout that could possibly emanate from all of this?
Well, Sakina, I can tell you now that it has really got nothing to do with the management of a fallout. The ANC is an organization of process. Throughout time, the ANC has always processed issues before it in the manner that it deems fit. Because when decisions of the ANC are ultimately implemented or taken to fruition, there must not be any doubt or suspicion of what the African National Congress is doing. Sometimes the ANC might be appearing to be moving slow. You know, there's a saying that the ANC tends to move like an elephant, but it does get to turn at some point. Look at the kind of processes that the ANC on its own volition has undertaken till now. I mean, we now have got guidelines that have been endorsed by the National Executive Committee. We now have got a process agreed upon by members of the National Executive Committee. We have now agreed with the engagement with all provinces to also hear their submission in terms of how some of the issues that you had raised. What does this mean? Do you continue to get paid when you have stepped aside? For how long are you stepping aside? What does this mean? You know, so it's really those kind of things. Even going back to say those of our cadres who have been charged, have they voluntarily appeared before the Integrity Commission? For instance, in the case of the Secretary-General, when charges were preferred against him, he voluntarily initiated a process to appear before the Integrity Commission so that he could be able to clarify them on the case. And he was also able to come back and clarify the National Executive Committee of such a process. The Integrity Commission itself did come to the National Executive Committee and also reported on the engagement that they shall have had, not just with the Secretary-General, including with all other NEC members who, out of their own volition, when their names were mentioned out in the public, then then voluntarily initiated a process to engage with the Integrity Commission.
Anything else of note discussed? For example, you expressed dissatisfaction with the issue of party veterans who have publicly pronounced against the developments in the party. Anything around that? Also the RET, and most South Africans wanted to know about the vaccine rollout program that, depending on who you speak to, either exists or doesn't exist. Did the ANC deliberate upon that?
Well, we did deliberate on the vaccine rollout. Actually, in the annual report of 2021, we did agree that the foremost task that needs to be executed and must be a priority for 2021 must be the vaccine rollout and our efforts to fight COVID-19. We have asked South Africans that they must continue to adhere to the health protocols, the wearing of masks, social distancing, and avoiding larger gatherings. We also expressed concern and urged government to fast-track the rollout of vaccines and make sure that not only to your frontline workers, but also make sure that we have got enough doses to be able to achieve herd immunity with a greater speed, so that we could be able to return our economy to normality. You'd appreciate, Sakina, that it is difficult to actually turn around the economy if we do not show seriousness and show that we are really acting with greater speed in terms of how we deal with COVID-19. Part of the reasons why we couldn't meet earlier during the day yesterday was because the president, in his capacity as the president of the Republic, had to go to the Eastern Cape to go and see one of the vaccine manufacturing sites, assess their capacity, and be sure that they will be ready to respond to the kind of challenges that we have. Cadres deployed in government also used the occasion of the National Executive Committee to also give us updates on what they are doing at all fronts to deal with the vaccine rollout and to make sure that we have got the necessary capacity to address the challenges of the day. Of course, as it has to do with whether it's what you call RET forces and all of that, the NEC did express its own concern that it cannot associate with such, and that no individual member of the African National Congress must be seen using an organizational platform to otherwise articulate or advance programs that will sponsor or fuel divisions in the organization. In this regard, we had said that there is no resolution of the African National Congress on radical economic transformation. The resolution of the ANC refers to radical socio-economic transformation, and that the ANC must take full ownership of its own resolutions and be able to articulate and advance them out in the public. The ANC is a structure that is self-respecting, takes itself seriously, and will not hesitate to take action against those that undermine organizational property. We have also urged our veterans that we have got sufficient platforms in the organization to be able to raise issues so that issues are not addressed either through other means, whether it's foundations or other forums that might themselves end up sponsoring divisions in the organization. That each and everything we do, regardless of what leadership we support in the African National Congress, must on its own be seen to be sponsoring unity well within our ranks.
Mr. Pule Mabe, thanks so much. ANC National Spokesperson Pule Mabe speaking to us about the conclusion of the National Executive Committee last night. Now, moving on with our headline news.